So today what I want to do is talk about Dita, the Darwin Information Typing Architecture, and really focus on providing a very basic introduction to that. I know that many of you have probably seen more advanced versions or maybe have some good experience with it. What I want to do today is really go back to the basics and talk about why this is out there and why we should perhaps care. So my name is Sarah O'Keefe. I'm the founder and president here at Scriptorium. I'm based in North Carolina, and my particular area of interest is content strategy for technical communication. And what that really means is that I'm interested in how content publishing and technology are all intersecting in creative and unusual ways during our very interesting times that we now live in. A couple of things to know about the webcast. Everyone except for me is currently muted. You can ask your questions through the questions area, which you have now found. We are recording the presentation, and we'll make that available within a day or two, typically after the event. And for those of you that are on Twitter, the Dita101 hashtag would be the place to go if you have color commentary about this session. So with that, we will take a look at our agenda. I want to talk a little bit about what Dita is, why you might care, the key concepts that are out there, typical scenarios where it gets used, where it is or is not appropriate, and is it right for you? So Dita, or as they say in Europe, Dita, is the Darwin Information Typing Architecture. And that particularly sort of unwieldy acronym, Darwin comes from the concept of evolution and the fact that you can derive new elements from the existing elements that are provided in the baseline architecture. Information typing is a concept that's been around for a good bit of time, and it is the idea that you can provide information or content in various categories. Dita in particular has task, reference, concept, and then a basic topic. Also some other things you can do, and you can actually customize and add additional information types if you wanted to. And the word architecture comes from the fact that Dita is not just a collection of tags, but also a specification that says here's how to do reuse, here's how to do single sourcing, here's some stuff that lets you generate output. So it goes beyond just sort of a collection of tags and thus an architecture. It was originally developed by IBM, and they then passed it on to Oasis, and which maintains it as an open source standard. So that's what it is, but why is it important? Why do we care, or for that matter, is it important? To talk about that, we have to back up a little bit and talk about structured authoring. Structured authoring is when you create information and the required organization of that information is enforced programmatically, which means the software enforces it. So if you're familiar with the concept of a template and you want, for example, to have a heading 1 and then it should always have some intermediate sort of introductory text before you go to another heading, that's a good example of something that is structured. You want to enforce a particular structure. Perhaps you want your list items to always have 2 or more bullets in them. So structured authoring is when you say, these are the standards for how my content is organized, and I want those enforced automatically by the software. Dita is a specific way or a specific pattern for doing structured authoring. It's a specific template and a specific perspective on how your content should be organized. And the other thing that I think is critical and we don't talk about enough is that Dita has widespread industry support. The software vendors, the XML authoring tools, the content management systems, the publishing tools, many of them provide out-of-the-box support to one degree or another for Dita, and that becomes important if you're in a position of looking at it and trying to figure out how to implement it. If you were to build a custom XML structure, you might find yourself in a position where you have to do a lot of configuration and customization in the tools just to get them to support your structure that you created. So it's not that Dita is necessarily better than all the other stuff, but the fact that it is widely supported is potentially helpful. So that's sort of the conceptual, high-level view of why we care. What is it really? Dita is an XML standard. So XML is the extensible markup language. It is a way of creating tags that define your content. And we'll look at some examples of what this looks like a little farther down the road. Dita specifically is built for topic-based authoring, creating topics and then gluing those topics together into books or help systems in particular. That becomes important later when you start thinking about transitioning to Dita. If you're in more of a book-based environment and you need to do topics, that is in some cases, rather wrenching shift to make that transition. Dita gives you the option or the possibility of working in XML without having to design your own structure, although in some cases you have to make some compromises. You may not think that the structure is exactly perfect for what you're doing, and then you have to make some decisions over whether it's good enough or whether you need to do more work with it. It is clearly a buzzword in technical communication. There's just no question about that. Lots and lots and lots of people are talking about Dita, and then it becomes this question of, is this really a direction that I need to be going in, or is this just the flavor of the day? And finally, it is perhaps a cost-effective way of creating, publishing, reusing, and exchanging structured information. So we'll take a look at some of those as we're going along. Dita itself, when we say Dita, it's really a collection of files. The first set of files that are in there are called the document type definitions, or DTDs, not DDTs. The DTDs define the structure. They say things like a topic must have a title and then it must have this kind of content following it. A task must contain steps. Those kinds of things that are in the DTDs in what is allegedly human readable format, but in practice is really pretty annoying to read unless you spend a lot of time in DTDs. There is something called the Dita Open Toolkit. This allows your Dita XML files and turn them into output, turn them into content that is viewable by other people. And it includes HTML, Eclipse, Help, Chum files, and a couple of other things actually, through the extensible style sheet language, which is a lovely, lovely programming language. And then you can also generate PDF through something called XSLFO, which stands for Extensible Style Sheet Language Formatting Object. It is safe to say that the Open Toolkit is not for the faint of heart, and there are other ways of generating output from Dita. But when we look at the components of the toolkit itself and sort of the Dita packages, this is what you get. So you have DTDs, you have the Open Toolkit, and then there is some documentation that describes how it all hangs together. It can be a little difficult to sort of get into because, again, there's not a lot of basic stuff in there. So this is what Dita publishing looks like. You take your collection of topics, and you would have dozens or hundreds or maybe even thousands of topics sitting over there on the left. You build something called a Dita map file, which is basically a table of contents with a collection of links that point over to those various topics. So the map file is equivalent to, let's say, a project file in a help authoring tool or a book file in some of your publishing tools. It says these topics in this sequence with this hierarchy. And then when you take the map file and run it through the Dita Open Toolkit, you get various kinds of output potentially. So that's kind of what the publishing tool chain looks like. And again, there are other ways of publishing other than the Open Toolkit, but if you want a sort of a pure open source, everything based on the Dita standard, then this would be kind of your baseline that you would start with. It's also important, I think, to talk about what Dita is not. Dita is not the holy grail of technical communication. It is very appropriate for some people and some environments. It is completely wrong for some others. Other things that is not are this. So it is not one structure to rule them all. It's probably safer to look at it as a toolbox. It is a toolbox that you can use in a variety of ways to solve your content problems. Now, the interesting question we get then is Dita better than XML? And that's That's an interesting question because for starters, both Dita is actually XML. So what people are really asking is Dita specifically better than XML generically? Or is it better than the custom XML that I might want to create for myself? And the answer to that is, well, it depends. We don't know which one is better. The context matters of where you are. So on the African savanna here, I think we can determine that the giraffe is probably in better shape. On the other hand, in an environment like this, you might go for the penguin. So what does the ideal habitat look like for Dita? And the answer to that is topic-oriented modular content. It was originally designed for doing software documentation, and so in many cases you will find that software documentation is a core use case or a core way that Dita was of doing stuff that Dita was designed for. So topic-oriented modular content that is being output to a variety of formats. Dita has some really useful features for content reuse. So if you have topics that need to be reused in multiple deliverables, in multiple books or multiple help systems, or if you have paragraphs that need to be reused across your document, that is something that it does well. Content exchange. I mentioned IBM as sort of the parent of Dita. Well, if you're in a situation where you are a customer, or sorry, a vendor of IBM, and you're required to send them content, TechComm content, they will probably tell you to ship Dita. So if you have a partner or if you have a customer downstream that requires you to send them content, it's a great way of doing content exchange, provided, of course, that they can accept the Dita content. And translation localization is really important. So if you're doing a lot of translation localization, then Dita becomes a very efficient way of managing that. What we're seeing in our consulting practice is that by far the most common business case that leads people to consider Dita is localization cost savings. They are looking at spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on translation, and the efficiency that you get from automated formatting, which is kind of a core feature of going into XML and Dita, makes it worthwhile. The other core feature that they look at is reuse. So those are the two most common ones, and localization is definitely out front in those two. There are other reasons to implement, but these are the ones that we see the most. So having said all these wonderful things, the next question is, of course, well, where are the challenges? What sorts of things does it not do so well? Dita specifically and XML in general will help you to do automated formatting, which means that you can push hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of pages through an automated process to generate your various output formats. That might be HTML, it might be PDF, it could be help systems, it could be all sorts of things. XML and Dita are really, really good at that. They're really, really bad at things like, oh, I really want to tweak that page break on page 17. It is possible to implement workflows where you can still do that, but it tends to destroy the automation and therefore the efficiency. So there's sort of an ongoing debate between these two things. Dita is not particularly good at narrative content, at content that flows from page 1 to page 300 and has a lot of sort of transitions in between and everything kind of hangs together. So novels, although if you think about it, a novel is not very highly structured, it does really need to flow, and you don't have these modular standalone topics in fiction usually. Textbooks maybe a little bit more so, but narrative content is not ideal. There are also some environmental concerns. The first one is that actually getting Dita to work, getting that infamous Dita Open Toolkit to work on the back end to produce nice-looking output is really, really challenging. It requires a high level of technical expertise, much more so than your basic authoring and publishing tools that are GUI-based, that have these lovely interfaces. So there's a lot of technical expertise required, really just some low-level programming, and that is not appropriate for all organizations. The other thing that Dita requires is a new set of skills potentially for your authors. And what we're dealing with here is the ability to write topics rather than just writing books, the ability to think about reuse and think about writing a topic that is sort of generic enough that it could be reused in a variety of places, but at the same time still useful, and maybe it needs to be customized, and how do you do that, and how do you separate out just the custom pieces in an efficient way. So if, as an author, I have lots and lots of expertise in writing books, big, huge user guides, then moving over to Dita and moving over to topics is going to be a little disconcerting. So here we have a simplified Dita topic, and this kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. There's not a whole lot going on here. There's a topic element at the top with an ID. There's a title. There's a body tag, and then inside the body tag we have some P tags, some paragraphs, and a note tag. If you're familiar even a little bit with HTML, you can kind of look at this, and it is not such a big deal. This is not, tremendously, horribly difficult. So that's what Dita looks like in a simplified version. And now let's take a look at what this actually looks like in a real-life, actually valid topic. And that's what this is. So here, what we have is that same topic with an ID, but then we've got a couple of other things going on and some additional attributes floating around in here. So let's take a look at what we've got. Up there at the top, you have what's called the XML declaration. This appears at the top of every XML file, including Dita XML file. It just sits there. You can ignore it. Technically, it's a processing instruction, but whatever. Every single XML file you ever have, it will be there. This next thing, that doc type, says, hello, I am a Dita topic, and my structure definitions live at that location with all the forward slashes in it. Again, this is something you generally just drop into your topics and don't worry about too much unless, of course, it's broken, and then it's no fun at all. But generally, those first two lines are just there. No worries. This particular topic has been labeled as being for an internal audience. So if I'm writing a zookeeping guide, then this would be for the internal audience of zookeepers as opposed to the external audience of, let's say, zoo attendees, zoo visitors. So audience equals internal is applied to the topic here, and it means that everything that's inside that topic, which I've indented for you to see visually what's going on, but the indents are optional. So everything between the angle bracket topic and then the very last line where there's an angle bracket / topic is inside the topic element. We'll look at a non-code version of this in a few minutes. Topics have IDs. This particular one has an ID of aardvark. If you've worked in some authoring tools, you will see that these IDs usually get assigned for you, and they're usually really long and really not human readable. They can be set up like this, but you have to be careful because they need to be unique. So you have to make sure you have unique topic IDs. Down here in the note, there is also an ID that allows us to address that note and reach into it, and later we're going to use that ID to reuse that note. So the ID of no feeding is sitting there so that we can get back to it later. This is a version of that same content displayed. I took a screenshot here out of something called Oxygen XML editor. There are lots of different XML editors, and most of them will give you what's called not WYSIWYG, but WYSIOO display. What you see is one option. This is a sort of formatted, sort of rendered version, but it's not, it's not print preview. It's not exactly how it's going to look in HTML necessarily, but at least everything's kind of formatted, and the tags, you don't have to look at the tags the whole time. A couple of things to highlight here. Up there at the top, it gives you a little hierarchy. So my cursor is in that first paragraph that says aardvarks eat mostly termites. And I know this because there's a little blue vertical bar on the left, And then up at the top, it says this is a P tag, which is a child of body, which is a child of topic. So it kind of orients you to where you are in this topic. And again, most XML editors will do this for you. This one has flagged my internal audience and kind of drawn a big green box around the section that is audience internal. So that helps me keep track of stuff that's potentially conditional. And then over there in the top right-hand corner, there's a little green, in this case, box. That box tells me that this topic is valid. This topic follows the required structure of a Dita topic. If it were invalid, I would get little red boxes, and they're actually, instead of being square, they're skinny rectangles. So I think even if you're colorblind, you can tell the difference between the two because they're shaped a little bit differently. So a couple of things we need to talk about here that are important to thinking about Dita. I've already mentioned topics, and I think I mentioned map files and how those are connected. And I'll talk about content references or conrefs and also specialization. So topics are a collection of little modules that you can then assemble into a larger coherent thing. The problem you run into with topics is not so much the idea of topics, but it turns out that writing really good topics is a different skill set from writing book chapters. So you have to think about consistency and reuse and the fact that they could be assembled in lots of different ways. And then, of course, from there, you take that and you assemble your quilt and or map file. Now, this analogy breaks down really fast because, of course, you don't generally take the quilts back apart, which is exactly what we do with topics, but I really like the picture, so there we are. Okay, so the map file lets you organize your topics sequentially, hierarchically, and then give them sort of a greater meaning. Once you pull them all together into a coherent deliverable, you have content, whereas before you had a collection of topics, but they didn't really have any relationships amongst themselves. Here is an example of a map file. So this is the code version of what a map file looks like. And again, it's pretty readable. It's not spectacular, but it's pretty readable. So up at the top here in the doc type, it declares itself. There's the XML declaration again, which I'm ignoring. The doc type says, hello, I'm a Dita map. Then there's some metadata, which I'm also going to ignore. XML lang, in this case, that is the language attribute. It says, hello, I am in US English. If you had a topic that was in a different language, you would put the language code in this attribute. And there are standard language codes for, as far as I know, just about every language you might ever need a code for, and a whole bunch that I've never heard of before. We had a customer not too long ago ask us for Macedonian, so they are out there. There's a title up there. There are some other ways of doing titles, but this is one. And then when we get down into the topic ref, that animalnutrition.xml, that is a pointer that says, okay, the first topic in this Dita map is animalnutrition.xml, and off we go. So it would go, when we actually render this Dita map into a deliverable, it would go off and put this in at this location. You can see the hierarchy of your topics in the Dita map. So this first topic ref goes all the way down 6 or 7 lines, and it's got 4 subordinate animal topics: aardvark, baboon, crane, and dingo. You can see that those are nested because they are inside that first animal nutrition topic ref. The topic ref animal nutrition ends at the bottom down there where it says /topic ref. And then aardvark does not have any child topics, and we know this because if you look at the topic ref, it has the / at the very end of the topic ref, at the end of line 2 here, inside there. That means I'm done. I've been opened, I've been closed. Baboon, crane, and dingo do the same thing. And then further down, you see adults and children are just closed. So that is a topic that you might call them leaves. It's the last, lowest level topic. Okay, now, so that's the Dita map, and that's what a basic Dita map looks like. These can get quite large, And you can also reference other Dita maps in a Dita map, which means you can create really funky nested stuff. This here is an example of a content reference or a conref. You'll remember that we had that lovely do not feed animals, scraps, snacks, or people food. And what we want to do is we want to reuse that content, that bit of information. Down here in baboon.xml, we have a conref which points over to aardvark.xml pound aardvark, which is the ID of the topic, / no feeding, which is the ID of the note. This is how you create a reference over to that other thing. If you're familiar with text insets or snippets or reusable content, they're called all sorts of different things in different applications, but that's what we're dealing with here. So conrefs you can use to reference another element. You can reference a collection of elements. So if you had, for example, 3 or 4 paragraphs underneath that note, you could pick them all up. And then there's some really interesting things you can do with ranges and push and pull, and we're just going to not pay any attention to that right now. What the important thing is, conrefs allow you to reference content from other locations and reuse it, which means you define it one time. For standard notes or standard warnings that are used in lots of places, this is potentially quite useful. Dita has a lovely feature called specialization. Specialization allows you to create additional elements without breaking the Open Toolkit. So you can create a custom new element and the Open Toolkit will know what to do with it. This is where we get the D for Darwin. Specialization is, in fact, actually an evolutionary concept, which not getting too far into the science, which I will almost certainly mangle. So let's talk for a second about your customization options. You basically have 3. There's customization, there's specialization, and then there's constraints or subsetting. So let's take a look at a simple version of these. This list of elements here, those are elements that are available to you inside the Dita body element. So this is sort of like as you're authoring along, these are the kinds of things that you can use. You can look at that and say, well, okay, you gave me note, but I didn't get warning or caution, and I didn't get sidebar. So I'm just going to create those elements new. I'm going to customize and create them. What that will do is it breaks the Dita standard, which means you have to modify all the processing, which is problematic. In the olden days, however, this was how we did extend standards. You would have to do it this way because there was no way to sort of integrate those new elements into the existing structure. So customization, useful but old-fashioned, breaks the standard, kind of problematic. A constraint is basically the exact opposite of a customization. In a constraint, what you say is, you know what, I'm not going to use screen, code block, syntax diagram, message block, or pre, so I'm going to exclude them so that my authors have less stuff to deal with. They'll have fewer elements to look at, fewer elements to choose from. I'm just going to exclude these. And you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to constrain the standard down and eliminate optional elements, and that would be fine. Specialization is the process of adding that warning, caution, and sidebar, but instead of just adding them willy-nilly, what you do is you say, oh, warning is actually a specialization of note. It is based on note, and it occurs in the same places as note, and it looks like this. So what you're doing is you're specializing from a generic element to a specific element. When you do it this way, then the Open Toolkit and the Dita structure in general understands that warning is actually based on note, and therefore it knows what to do with a warning when you process it. Now, you're probably going to want to create custom processing for warning so that it does, unique things with warning instead of just rendering it as a note. But it's really, really useful to be able to build these in and not break things. So warning would be based on note, caution could be based on note, and sidebar might be based on the section element. So you create additional elements specialized from the original element. The business case for XML in general typically rests on these 5 factors. the idea of content exchange, the idea that XML, because it is text files, is easier to move from system A to system B than binary proprietary files are. Database publishing, it is useful to extract information from a database, turn it into XML, and then use that XML to drive a publishing system for that data. Content reuse, reduced duplication, less redundancy, cheaper localization, cheaper publishing, fewer total pages. That's kind of the argument for reuse. Basically, it's a lot cheaper to maintain one topic, one piece of content, and use it in 5 or 6 places than it is to copy and paste and then forget that you copied and pasted and then update 2 or 3 but not the other 4, and you just get into all sorts of trouble there. Automated formatting and publishing is a big one, especially if you have localization. And then compliance. If you're told by the the government that you have to deliver in a specific format, it would be wise to do so. If your customer says you must deliver in this format, and this is common in aerospace, then you might want to go ahead and do that. Beyond this, because this is sort of the generic business case for XML, beyond this, you have some additional things you might look at for DITA. Less content modeling because you're not going to do it yourself, and some other things here. So let's take a look at these. You're going to reduce your content modeling effort. If you look at DITA and say, you know what, this is good enough, it's pretty close to what I need, so I'm just going to use it, or even it's pretty close to what I need, I'm going to do some specialization, but it gets me 80% of the way there, then that would be a reasonable solution for you to go ahead and start doing your content modeling. If you start from scratch and build up your own structure out of nothing, you're going to have a tremendous amount of work to do. This approach, or this rationale, rests on the idea that DITA is a pretty good fit for your content. And that's really the first thing you have to assess. Is it really a reasonable match for what you're trying to do? Portability is next. So can I make my content truly portable from system A to system B? If everybody is using DITA, then clearly you could move the content around and life would be great. The problem you run into, even with XML, is if my XML structure is different from your XML structure, I may still have problems trying to move the content around. So you can potentially have better portability, but this argument rests on the idea that everybody is moving in this direction, which may or may not be true, so something to consider there. DITA has some very good support for reuse. The topics that are referenced in map files, the conrefs, which we looked at, and then the key refs, which we didn't look at, but they are sort of a more sophisticated version of conrefs. So it has some nice features in there, and of course the fact that you're doing modular topics makes your content inherently easier to reuse because you're not working at a book level. There is a lot of software support for DITA. Many, maybe most XML authoring tools provide support for DITA. A lot of XML authoring tools, or sorry, a lot of DITA tools support only DITA and not generic XML. They don't support all kinds of XML. They only support specifically how DITA is architected. Now, you can kind of get into a circular argument here that, well, the tools support it, so this is what I should use. And of course, if that's what you use, then the tools aren't going to support anything else. But if you're in a position right now of looking at DITA, trying to figure out if you should go in that direction, then you do have to look at the cost and the implications of custom XML and what that would look like. Are there tools out there that can support what you're trying to do? You have lots and lots and lots of outputs by default out of the open toolkit, and then there are a variety of other tools that will also support DITA content for publishing. The OT is a reasonable starting point for output, but it's not suitable for a production workflow on day one. It has to be customized, it has to be configured, it has to be improved. And that customization, configuration, and improvement is really, really difficult and fairly time-consuming. So there's a pretty significant expense that you're going to be facing if you go in this direction, and that's something that needs to be accounted for in the business case. It's not that spending the money is a terrible idea. It's that you need to know up front that this is going to happen. That brings us, of course, to the fascinating question of, is this right for you? Is this something that you should be doing? And we spend a lot of time asking that question on behalf of our customers and trying to figure out what the right answer is for different organizations. For some people, the answer is yes. If DITA meets all of your requirements, you have a business partner that requires DITA, you need to single source, you don't have existing content, you don't have legacy content, because the expense of converting, migrating content can be significant. So if you don't have any, that's a point in DITA's favor. If you can be flexible with markup so that you can do implementation more easily, you don't have to do a huge amount of specialization, then that's something to consider. I would also add to this that you might want to look at the sort of industry landscape. DITA is getting a lot of traction in the US, but when you look at Europe, and particularly Germany, DITA tends to get highly customized in Germany for its applications, much more so than in the US. So you might look at this question differently when you're saying that, oh, I can easily find lots and lots of DITA people here in this area, here in North Carolina, or out in Silicon Valley, or in another high-tech area in the US. That may not be true, or may not be true as much in other locales. So something to consider there is sort of market share, your local market share, and what's that going to do when you try to hire people. Some people say no. If your content must conform to a specific standard, such as S1000D, which is used in aerospace and military, then you probably should not use DITA. We actually had a case where somebody used DITA and then was planning to convert it to S1000D, and they had some good reasons for doing things that way. But generally, if you're planning to deliver S1000D, you should probably start with S1000D and not something else. If your content is narrative and should remain narrative, then you probably want to think twice about implementing a topic-based, topic-oriented coverage. If your semantic requirements, and by this I mean how accurately the XML has to describe your information, if you have industry-specific requirements, very complex or very strict requirements that are non-negotiable, then you really are going to have an uphill battle with DITA, and you may have a lot of specialization, and that may or may not be worthwhile. Some industries have looked at actually creating specializations for those exact industries. So for example, there is a semiconductor specialization for DITA that addresses some of the DITA issues, or addresses some of the semiconductor requirements inside DITA. There's also an e-learning specialization. And finally, you really want to look at the question of technical support or technical expertise, or whatever you want to call this. If you know that there is no way you're going to get any support if you have technical problems, and you're not the person who likes to play around with this stuff until you get it up and running, then you really want to think twice about this. If you can hire external consultants, great. If you have somebody internally who's really good with technology and likes learning new stuff and kind of wants to be a baby programmer, awesome. But if not, and you can't get that support anywhere, then you're going to really be facing an uphill battle in getting this all to work, and I would say that that is potentially a showstopper. There is, of course, also a maybe or an it depends. What if DITA is not an exact match? What if customization and specialization would be required? And then the question becomes, how much? How expensive will it be? How hard will it be to do this? Is that a direction that we should go in? So those are kind of the factors that we look at when we're considering DITA as a match for our customers. Having said all of that, it's probably worth noting that certainly more than half, and I think possibly more like 60, 70, or even 80% of our customers do end up using DITA for some of the other reasons that I've described earlier. Okay, and with that, I believe I am ready to take your questions. So I will ask you to jump into the questions area if you haven't already, and fling over some questions and see what we can come up with here. Is Dita something that you're considering? Is it something that you've already implemented? Are you running into problems? What sorts of things do you want to know that I haven't addressed? And I'd also be interested in whether this has sort of shed any light on the direction that you're going in and how you might want to make this work for yourself. So there's a question here. That's a really interesting question. How much training time does it typically take per writer to get started? There are 2 or maybe 3 aspects that have to be addressed in training. Item 1 is writing modular content, writing topic-based content. Writers who already know how to do that, maybe they've been in a help authoring system or in a different topic-oriented system, will have an easier time with the idea of topics. So topic-based authoring is kind of item 1. That's maybe a day. Item 2 is the Dita styles, or not styles, sorry, but the Dita elements. You know, what's a P tag? What's a note? What's the difference between a pre-tag and a code block? Those kinds of things. And then the other things you have to address are, how do I author in my authoring tool? Authoring Dita content in FrameMaker is different from authoring Dita content in Oxygen. Not good or bad, just different. And then finally, there are other tools that you may have to address in training, like specifically a content management system. So what you would have to look at in the training time question is, how big is the gap for topic-based authoring? How big is the gap for the authoring tools? How big is the gap for the content management system? And then there's also some interaction among all those tools. But those are the things that, and then of course the Dita expertise. So somebody who's coming, from absolutely nowhere, you might be looking at a couple of days to do the topics and sort of the general concepts, and a couple more days to do the authoring tools and the content management system. So a similar question here, how difficult is it to train writers to write topic-based content? That depends on the writer. And the number one issue that I look for in training is not so much where are they coming from, what do they know, any of that stuff. What I look for is the question of, do they want to learn? Because people who want to learn will do their thing and they will be fine. People who don't want to learn are very difficult to teach no matter what. So how difficult is it to train them to write topic-based content? Where are they coming from? How much experience do they have? But I think more importantly, how flexible are they and how badly do they want to learn? All right. How important is it to have a comprehensive Dita style guide that supports a Dita-based authoring environment? Well, it certainly helps. I mentioned the pre-tag. So there's a pre-tag, which is similar to the pre-tag in HTML. There's also a tag called code block, and there's another one called code PH or code phrase. Code phrase is for code that you're putting inside a paragraph. Code block is for, as you might expect, blocks of code, paragraph length blocks of code. But what's the difference between code block and pre? It's probably more critical that you pick something and you stick with it than it is that you pick the exact correct thing. So my advice is to find these issues where people are being inconsistent and address them. Try to address them up front by providing some templates and some model topics. Here's how we want you to implement these kinds of things. But it does help. And how important is it to have a comprehensive style guide? The more authors you have, the more important it is, because the more variability you get. And we like to make jokes about a prairie dogging, which is when you're all in cubes and people stand up and kind of stick their head over the cube wall and yell stuff. If your group is bigger than that and you can't accommodate prairie dogging because you have 60 people or 30 people in 10 different locations, then you really need to support them with a style guide and do some stuff with that. So, okay, let's see. Oh, interesting questions. does there appear to be anything on the horizon that may compete with Dita for XML authoring? There are some other things out there, but nothing that's gaining the kind of traction that I've seen for Dita. The things that are out there that I've heard about, there is an XML standard called O manual, the word manual, like document, with an O in front of it. That is used for guidelines for fixing things, like how to disassemble something and reassemble it, that type of thing. There are some other specs like Mallard, but I would have to say that the thing that probably is the most interesting from a competitive point of view is actually HTML5. And then there's the question that follows up on that, which is, how good is the binding between Dita semantics and HTML5 output semantics? Do the tools do this well? In order to get from Dita to HTML5 through the Open Toolkit, you would have to run out, you would have to do a transformation. And there's some preliminary work that's being done on this, but I would say it's really not that good right now. It will get there, and it's technically not that difficult a problem, but I wouldn't describe it as awesome at this point. It's sort of ick. So, all right, I have a couple of questions about presentation and issues, but let's take a look at this one. When converting to Dita, what is the best methodology to use? I want to say margaritas, but okay, so the serious answer to this is that if your content is well organized and well structured in the source, you know, it followed a template, everybody followed styles and followed a style guideline, then you're going to be in reasonable shape and you'll be able to automate a lot of stuff. If your source content is really completely incompatible with Dita, it just isn't organized the same way, and it's all over the place, and it's not consistent, and the formatting is a huge mess, and everything is overrides, then you know, you may actually have to rewrite it. You may not have any sort of methodology. You may just have to start over. So there are a variety of automated solutions out there, and what you choose kind of depends on what you're starting from, you know, what your source files are in. But there are lots of ways of automating this. It's just that automation will only help you if the actual source content is reasonably well organized. You know, it has implicit or inherent structure. So it's a really, really big problem. And good question. Actually, all these questions are good. Okay. If you have a company that manufactures electrical equipment or really anything else that has safety implications, you know, life and health and death and injury, I'm concerned that moving to topic-based authoring would mean that we would have to repeat safety messages in each topic. Do you have any experience with this? All right, so for starters, let's assume that you actually do have to repeat the safety messages in each topic. You know, the sort of generic safety messages for what used to be the book. If that were the case, the first thing I would probably do is go in and find a way of injecting those generic safety messages automatically. So instead of actually including them in every topic, what I would do is set it up so that when I generate output, it includes them in every topic. That said, doing so doesn't seem like a particularly useful approach from a reader's point of view. I've seen this done a couple of ways. For example, the first time, let's say you have web-based content, the first time that somebody goes into the web-based content in a given day, or in a given hour, or in a given session, it displays some safety messages, and then after that, the safety messages are not displayed. So the assumption is that the reader saw the safety messages going in, and then, you know, after that, they can kind of read content just as they would in a book. They don't, you know, the safety messages aren't, I assume, displayed on every page. There's also the option of providing only the relevant messages on the relevant pages. So that's a choice. But I have seen this done with sort of disclaimers, and you have to sort of click past something that says, I swear I read the safety messages, really I did. So there are a couple of different ways of doing it that go beyond, you know, just having to just repeat everything all over the place. There's a similar, less dangerous or less, I don't want to use the word impactful. There's a similar problem around copyright and trademarks, and do I have to mark trademarks all over the place now that I no longer have a book and the stuff in the front? So you might take a look at those. I'm not saying it's not an exact analogy because misusing or leaving out a trademark is clearly not as big a concern as a safety message, but you might look for some techniques there that might help. All right. How can Dita and XML content work for information that is presentation-based, heavily graphic, and diagram-based teaching materials? XML in general and Dita in particular have the ability to have graphics, as you're going along. What they don't do so well is arbitrary page-by-page formatting. So if you have a situation where each page is uniquely formatted and each page is special, you're going to have some issues with this. If your teaching materials are pretty straightforward in that there's some, there's an objective, and then there's some prerequisites, and then there's a list of things for the instructor to do, and then there's a graphic, and then there's maybe some PowerPoint slides. PowerPoint, believe it or not, is pretty highly structured. It's got a title and some bullets, and maybe a graphic. So I'm not sure I have enough information to sort of answer that question, but arbitrary formatting, bad. Lots of graphics, not a problem. Is it possible to output from Dita to PowerPoint? Yes. You can either, somebody did some work on Dita actually to PowerPoint format, and the other option is to render from Dita over into PDF with something that looks like slides and then use the PDF slides. It's also been done with HTML. So there are a couple of options there. But as far as tools, I would describe them more as toolkits. So there's a good bit of work that might have to be done there. All right, there's a question here about mobile and Web 2.0 content authoring. So does or could Dita support mobile and Web 2.0? Okay, so mobile content typically means HTML5, and it is certainly possible to output HTML5 from Dita. There are also some creative things that are often done in mobile, like progressive disclosure, which you could do via Dita source content, and perhaps, let's see, so HTML5, progressive disclosure, oh, and of course, responsive design principles, you can certainly output HTML and then have style sheets that adapt to support various kinds of mobile devices. So that's not necessarily a Dita problem per se, it's more of a style sheet design problem. Now on the Web 2.0 side, I assume that what you're referring to here is commenting, maybe posting to blogs and maybe wiki type things. It is possible to render Dita into something that then supports commenting and those kinds of things. I don't think there's anything that does it sort of out of the box. There was an effort made to go, well, there are some ways of getting Dita content out into either WordPress or Drupal. If you're interested in that, drop me an email and I'll send you the specifics. But Dick Johnson from VR Communications has done a good bit of work on that. And in fact, we're using his tools on our contentstrategy101.com site, which is authored in Dita and then published in draft in WordPress. So yes, it definitely can be done, but it is, a lot of this is really a hardcore do-it-yourself, build your own, find somebody else that's taken a shot at this, and then take it from there. So it can be kind of, terrifying. So, okay, any other questions? Those were all really, really interesting, actually. If you don't have any other questions, I'm going to say feel free to drop at this point. If I see any other questions come in, I'll handle them. And I want to thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you on our next round of webcasts. We've got one coming up in a couple of weeks on localization. And then I believe we have one on the business case for TechComm in August. So for those of you who are, in the northern part of the world, happy summer, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.